Okay. Thanks everyone for making it out. Welcome to Dead Reckoning Collective's Spring 2021 workshop group, sponsored by Black Rifle Coffee Company. I'm excited to get started with you guys, but we're gonna go over a few parameters first before we start. You guys already read all the instructions and the guidelines. We are going to start with Mac first. And then we'll take a break, and then we're gonna do Keith's poems, and then we'll take another break, and then we'll do Plunkett's short story, okay? A few reminders. The author, when he or she is being workshopped, is not allowed to participate in the discussion. They just sit and absorb the information as we go. Everyone participates on either end of the discussion, and then at the end, the author is able to come in, okay?
With the cup holder ripped out of the car to make room for a TAC radio that never got bolted down, John tossed the empty Wawa cup on the floor of the passenger side. 311, I need a medic and some more units, someone got run over. John flipped on his lights and sirens and smoothly pulled out into traffic. He could tell by Tony's voice whoever had been hit was in trouble. Tony had one of the coolest demeanors on the shift and rarely allowed emotion to sneak into his radio voice. 311, let medics know he's got a serious bleed in his groin and theirs. At that, John kicked it into gear and started flying. His sirens didn't have quite the desired effect, like Moses had had on the Red Sea, but most cars still moved out of his way. With each car that refused to get over, John's blood pressure spiked. To compensate, rather than stop and clear each intersection, John slowed just enough to convince himself he could cut through without getting T-boned. The Taurus shuddered with the high RPMs, and John couldn't help but smile as adrenaline overcame agitation.
Let's start with areas where we felt like the story was really working very well. What did you guys find to be the strongest points in this story?
So like to sum up the piece in general, the way that I kind of just got from it was about like service and like kind of the contradiction with it, like being like in like the struggle between being good and bad, and just kind of like the reflection of what he did was admirable and his internal struggle with it. And so the author just did a really good job of creating that conflict within that character by producing this very action-packed story in general.
Yeah, I thought one of the stronger parts from the story from a craft perspective is just that we have an immediate conflict. Right from the first two paragraphs, we already know there's a moment of tension, there's something going on, there's something at stake. I'm immediately pulled in as a reader to what John's struggle is. I want to find out why exactly it is that this is his last day at work.
Right off the bat, like one of the sentences that just stood out was, like most people in an extraordinary situation, he was eager for guidance. And so John, as being a police officer in this, it's like as an extraordinary job and being able to do extraordinary things, you still feel like you're helpless and you're looking for somebody else to do it, when in reality it's up to him to make this happen.
Yeah, when he's the one that should be doing it.
Yeah, so that sense of responsibility and pressure is self-imposed, and at like any moment you would want to pass it off to somebody, but John in this situation was like, it's just up to me.
I immediately compared it to Kent Anderson and tried to dispel that, because Kent Anderson wrote novels about, a Vietnam veteran coming back and becoming a police officer. And so I felt there were similarities in the setting, and I didn't want to do that. Then the more and more I read, read it over again, I realized it wasn't necessarily the content, it was actually the description. As John is describing himself, as John is, describing his demeanor, his situation, his aspirations and things like that. That was what actually reminded me of Kent Anderson in a really, really good way.
Yeah, and another moment for me, right at the end of the first paragraph on a sentence level, resigning was the right choice. He was sure. Packing those two right next to each other, resigning was the right choice, and having to revalidate it with he was sure. As a reader, I'm immediately thinking, I feel like that's protesting a little bit too much. I'm not sure if he's actually sure. And is he sure? And that keeps me reading to the next sentence. And I think that's exactly what a short story needs to do, is to keep you reading to the next sentence after the next sentence after the next sentence.
He does that again on the bottom of, right before we have that page break. It says, thank you, on page 1, thank you, sir, but I am sure, John answered with quiet firmness, which I love. He wasn't going to spell it out for the lieutenant, but this whole thing had only helped steady. Every time I read an already wavering mind, which I think that adverb kind of helps it.
I had notes on the way that played out, essentially getting at the same thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
It just really helps. Like, he had already planted that idea that this was something he was kind of waffling on that like spongy area already. And then to have that solidify it, then we don't need the whole page like foregrounding why he's making this decision. All we need to know is that he's made it, and then it was difficult for him to do so.
So even a little bit before that, he did lay out in a way with this reiteration and the pace where he's like, despite the fact he's grown character, despite the fact he spent the last year, despite the fact that has decent pay and job security, John knew the way. And so it was just a really good sense of pace where he's extending it, and then matter of fact, extending it with this just explanation, and then solidifying it in just like quick fashion. So it's like a push, pull perspective, push, pull perspective, and that's what I liked about like the whole story. Is it is action, pulling out of that moment, action, pulling out of that moment.
Yeah, that's something I want to come back to also, is those push and pull moments.
Yeah, it reminded me of if you've ever, made a decision like this and you've explained it to someone and they're just sitting there listening to you, but you over explain the shit out of it, and give a million reasons that they wouldn't have even asked, for one of. That's kind of what that reminded me of.
I mean, over explaining is a trauma response.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I thought, just kind of broad strokes on the piece. I was really interested in the fact that he captured the ego of a servant citizen, and then constantly used that to construct this like really compelling narrative and how that can go both for and against the protagonist in this situation. There was, I love how there was high stakes in this, that we weren't, waddling along, that it was immediately like that there were stakes right off the bat. As you mentioned, tension right in the first couple of paragraphs that make you want to keep reading. And I really love how we got inside the protagonist's head. I just really loved diving into that mentality of, and again, the ego that was there, as well as the self-reflection that happened at certain points. And I guess a particularly great part of this story was when we get into the live tissue training, where he's calling back to the work on the pig. That was, it's kind of like if you're going to use a gun in a movie, you got to use it in the first 10 minutes, right? And I felt like this was a similar deal here, where it was like, hey, if we're going to kill somebody, if we're going to get violent later on, we need to get violent soon on. Yeah. And with that live tissue training and the way it was written was just fantastic.
I think it's the strongest part of the story.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's like, if I'm telling somebody about why they should read this short story, it's like, man, the fucking live tissue stuff is great.
If we're talking about what works for us, I think obviously everyone's in concurrence that the live tissue section was what really worked for us. The paragraph that the author elected to start with, I think, was really where I was hooked. So I might be in the minority here. I wasn't exactly hooked with this first page, but once we were going lights and sirens, I was there. I was flying down the street with you, the author, and the idea that he throws the coffee cup and he sees the light streaming by. That's when I got really sucked in. And
my initial gut response is that there was some restructuring that needed to happen because of some of what you brought up of sort of that little bit slower start. And I ended up kind of circling back to, no, I think after trying to figure out a better way to structure it, I think it actually is structured the right way. But I think that first section could be cut down by about a third. I've got a lot of kind of strikeouts here.
Yeah, I made a note about the transition. I thought there was something, and I think maybe that's it. Because there was something about the transition that bothered me. In the end, the transition works well, like back into, yep, I'm leaving, after the metal story. But the beginning transition didn't sit well with me. And I think that might have been it. I think it might have been because this section was too long.
Yeah, we could strike out that before the section break.
we can strike off that last sentence there. About a month earlier, John had earned the medal for failure. So we're doing too much foreshadowing there. We can leave that at, he wasn't going to spell it out for the LT, but everything that had happened only helped steady his wavering mind. Like, that's a great note to leave on before we jump into the next section.
I had very similar comments because I feel like there's a lot of throat clearing going on in the first half of the page where the writer's figuring out how they want to present this story, what details to leave in, and there's a lot of really great details, but I said the same exact thing, is just lop that last sentence off. We don't need it.
That last sentence also confuses, which also might contribute to the propensity for restructuring it, because it throws off the timeline of the story.
Yeah.
He lists it as, the author listed as 1 month earlier, and then the bottom paragraph of that same page, 311 is Tony. Today, John thought, those fucking street racers are going to get someone killed. John had only been on his own now for a few months, having just completed his final training in February. So it's 4 different timestamps in one sentence. And then if you turn the page, we have Philly in late March. February to March is not a few months. It's 1 month. So it has to either be 1 month or it needs to not be a few months. And I feel like it is just that. It's throat clearing. This author felt like he needed a hand-holding sentence when he really didn't.
Yeah, and on the time note too, another thing that I really kind of went back and forth on is whether, when we do get into the live tissue training, whether that should be a hard break right there. Where do we need to start off in present time and then go back, or do we just start back at live tissue training? Do we just have a hard break there? I don't have like a strong answer on that. I can see it working both ways.
So as all y'all are saying, that's like one of y'all's favorite parts, maybe as like a medic, that's probably my least favorite part, and maybe it was because the way it was brought up is it was one moment in time, like the current events, and then it's a flashback into why he got that medal and all that stuff, and then all of a sudden it reads as a very like like an explanation. And he's like explaining why this is important, and it's like very detailed oriented, but it reads more of like a flashback, and so maybe that transition break would have been a little bit better to me. But I was like, why are we explaining so much more in the middle of a story? Because he's on the way to the call, and it's like I'm with you. I was like, I'm in the action at this point. I'm not thinking too much and like going into flashback. Like, I'm getting focused in that I'm about to go do this. And so reading that 2 paragraphs for me pulled me out of the action scene. And so maybe if it was a transition break, I would have been more prepared of like, okay, we're stopping, focusing on something. Okay, now we're coming back to the action.
That was something too, and we can get into it more later, but like in terms of, the audience, like I had a little bit of trouble determining who the projected audience was, because you can tell that the writer has skin in both games, law enforcement and military experience. But just, continue. There were some things that were explained, and then some things where it was just an acronym. I always try to look at acronyms first, and then start to look at other verbiage that may be understood by some and not by others. But that was one thing I thought I could use clarity on. Again,
it's more for like a medical thing. He mentions like the axillary artery. It's not an artery, it's the brachial artery, so a medical person's going to see that immediately, and he's talking about something medical as if he is some kind of subject, or the author's some kind of subject matter expert, where I'm immediately like, okay, you're spot on with all of this, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, that's just maybe just to tell you where you're at in the body part. And so he did do that, or the author did that a little bit, where he's explaining as if you don't know anything about it, and then assuming you know something about it. And so I think if he was just to explain it and as a part of the story, like, hey, this is what I was, if I was just doing, that portion would have just been that much stronger, because it is such a reflective piece of what's about to happen and what he's about to get himself into and why he is that person to be able to do it.
So this is an excellent point. You, from the very jump, you're teaching your reader how to read your piece. And this changes with every piece every time. So while I don't necessarily need to know exactly what that artery is, I, as a reader who's not trained in this, I need to be able to at least pretend in that moment that I know what he's telling me without realizing that the author is telling me. So it's a fine line between just presenting the information in a way that your reader is going to be able to understand it and receive it, and pulling them out of that story and recognizing, like, no, I don't want to read this bullshit about where these are. I don't need to know where this artery is. I just need to know that that we're in trouble here. And this also goes to Keith's point about the acronyms. I don't necessarily need to know what their role is or what their rank is in the hierarchy of this police department, but I do need to know, like, who's in the car with him, who does he respond to, who does he answer to, who answers to him, like how does the rank and file fall here? And you don't necessarily need to do that with titles. You can do that with like in-scene direct action. Yeah, so both of those I think tie back into
Yeah, I had one note in here about where I actually wanted a little bit more information on page 7. He says, with 311, let medics know he's got a serious bleed in his groin and theirs. At that, John kicked it into gear and started flying. His sirens didn't have quite the desired effect. So what he's indicating here is there's a serious bleed in his groin and theirs and cut off, and you're seeing that switch in motion. I know where that's coming from because if you do have medical training, you know, okay, there's a major artery that runs through the groin area, and that was what triggered him.
Yeah.
I think that the reader without medical training needs to know that that's what's triggering him to throw it into high gear and get there quicker. Like, we need to know that, and I don't think it needs that whole paragraph or anything, but maybe there's another half sentence we tack on.
You could even foreshadow about the pig. Right?
Okay, yeah. So this was the second, is that push-pull, right? Keith is spot on here, and one suggestion might be to consider mirroring the scene from the pig. But we can help the reader better understand that level of trauma with the pig, because the pig scene is very strong. We literally break the story up with exercise. I don't necessarily think that we need all of those calm moments in this scene. It's a very flash, quick scene, and it should be. But if we've already set the reader up for that traumatic level of engagement on the page, they won't need as much room in the secondary scene.
I had this very similar comments, and that's why I wanted to see that scene come much earlier, because as a reader, I'm pulled in if I get all that, and then I feel like I actually am sort of trained because I've kind of been through the training sequence in the narrative. And then I feel like I'm right there with John.
That's a cool way of putting it.
As he arrives with the trauma patient.
Good.
On pacing for this, I think that the paragraphs need to be broken up a little bit more. I think we need to use white space strategically.
Yeah.
Because it is an intense piece, because there is stakes and everything.
So to kind of add on just with that little brief thing is, within that dialogue, he says 311, let medics know he's got a serious bleed. That serious bleed in the groin tells you that it's serious, and maybe after that section break, that's when the training is being introduced. It's like, because now it's like a foreshadow, like a serious bleed, and it's like, how does he know it's a serious bleed? Bam, going into the pig scene.
It's a great idea, Tyler.
And then going into,
if you wanted to make the first one on scene panicky though too, you could also describe it in a way that like everyone's gonna get a serious bleed might not hit for everybody. There's a fuck ton of blood coming out, over the radio, because you know that if a police officer is using that kind of language on the radio, that like there's a situation. So I mean, you could even do something like that where it's gonna hit for everybody.
Let me ask you this, as a collective group, does everyone fully understand what the pig looks like in the live tissue experiment? And does everyone remember or is able to recall what John looks like in that exercise?
That's a great question, because I think, again, just through my own lens, and I think I'm coloring with my own life experience a little bit, and maybe jump past that. But I did have one of my kind of critiques for the author on this is I didn't think that there was enough character description of not just the protagonist, but even some of the ancillary characters, where we don't need not a whole paragraph, but simple things of like color of eyes, hair, is there facial hair, stature, just little, and they don't necessarily all need to come together. We can peel that onion over the course of the story, but we should be building. I had a great picture of what the inside of the protagonist's mind looked like, but I did not really have a picture of, I tended, because I know the author, to put the author in those shoes, and I don't think that's what we want. I don't think that was the author's intention.
Yeah, I was even thinking, you actually raised a really good point about projecting your own life experiences into the story, because I was thinking when, in the live tissue training, the writer describes his attire and stuff like that, but I already had an image of him as a police officer, maybe a little bit more muscle, maybe a little bit more chub, versus the skinny kid out of basic training doing the live tissue training. You know what I mean? There's no description of that. There's no description of weight or, age in the face or anything like that. It's because I'm picturing him as someone else.
Yeah. And, there's to the credit there, like, the sergeant at the end where he's like, and he slaps the wall, and I don't know if he says waddles off or if I projected that myself.
No, he says he's sweaty. He says he
burps
down the hallway.
That one, it's like perfect. I'm getting like a John Goodman police character, and and so I thought that was a great way of not literally describing him, but you're painting a picture with your words for sure,
which is good. It means we can relate.
That is perfect. Yeah. I think we needed more of that with the protagonist and some of the other characters in there, where we had a better idea in our head. And for the person reading this who doesn't know who wrote, like I said, I just defaulted to, because via lack of description, I projected the author in those shoes. For the person reading this, they may have a harder time getting into the story because they, maybe they project somebody they know, or maybe they don't, into those shoes. We need to provide that description.
Yeah. I think those minor refinements, like you're saying, just add a couple more physical aesthetic details to the protagonist and some of the ancillary characters. I am cautious to fuck with that scene too much, because it reminded me of the buffalo in O'Brien's the things they carried. It's so uncomfortable. It's so cringy, and I think when you hear O'Brien talk about that scene, he says, if you think it's bad what we do to buffalo, you should see what we do to humans, right? And so in this, I'm like, God, this is so horrible what we're doing to this pig. And it's like, and then, it's like, look what happens when we do this kind of shit to humans. So I think anytime I'm making those connections between two parallels, and anytime that I'm having done that actual training, I mean, I was there again, smelling the things. I think it's really the most powerful part, and we don't just be cautious of fucking with it too much, because it is impactful.
For sure.
I was really happy with the dialogue for the most part. My own kind of bias here is I really geek out on the opening of stories. Like, I'm really, those first couple paragraphs, the lead is like, it's my baby. Like, it's the thing that I always, if there's a thing that I consistently have notes on anything that I edit, it's always the lead. And I think that in this, the opening sentence, the hands lay on top of each other, both pointing directly at a black Roman numeral 2. Now, that's a setup for that payoff that comes later on in that last section where we go back to the Roman numeral 3.
Yeah.
I understand what we're trying to do there. Not sure that that's the opening line for this, though.
That's not the best point of entry.
Yep. Like, I think we can open a little bit stronger there. And then when we go into I don't have a problem necessarily with having the inner monologue there on the second line of the first paragraph. Shirley there's very few instances where I think that works in a writer's repertoire.
There's a lot of shore too.
Yeah.
In that first page.
Even the rest of it here, surely having a ridiculous gaudy clock next to your desk makes work agony. That sounds like something somebody wrote, not what somebody said inside their own head.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that goes right into kind of what I did. I immediately crossed off John thought, because usually italicized means that he's thinking it, and then immediately he wrote, and he kept that thought. And like, I made a note at the bottom. It just seemed like a lot of thinking, like him reiterating that he's thinking when the italicized is there. Like even down at the bottom, 311 is on Tony today, John thought. And then right below, he's like, John only had been on for a month. It's like, I think people know, and there's a little bit better ways to create that pause within a thought. Like, and he looked back at his watch, Like that's where you kind of create those pauses rather than saying he actually thought, show him thinking, like looking up at the sky, putting tongue to cheek or something, or tapping on the desk, tapping foot.
Absolutely.
Like just like a quick little action to show that, hey, this is a quick pause and that thought, and then going right into it.
I don't want 4 lines about him thinking that his boss is an asshole. I want to know that his boss is an asshole.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was the inner monologue is good for the most part, but I think that there's just a way to show the actions of him thinking with the words attached to it in the italicized font.
And there felt like there was some inconsistency to his tone with his inner monologues, like going back to the first line, surely having a ridiculous gaudy clock next to your desk makes work agony feels a lot different than the next page. Jesus, he thought, why the fuck do I keep drinking this shit? It's a totally different narrative tone.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout there, I felt like there was a shifting around, like couldn't put a firm beat on exactly who John was because we were shifting around a little bit too much.
Well, and I think also to that point, the inner dialogue here and the spoken dialogue, for me, they both face the same issue. And that's that it's not actually dialogue. We're transferring information to the reader that we've not put in scene. That's what it is.
That
right?
I am sure really, really, really bothered me in the spoken dialogue.
I don't hate that that's there, but it could maybe be read more naturally.
Yeah.
I have found the same issue in a lot of the dialogue. If we look in the after the second break, where it says 314, 311 applied a tourniquet, but the injury is in the groin, we have an ellipses. How far out are the medics? First of all, in this scene with this sense of urgency, we're not going to have a fucking ellipses, right? Like, no one's going to, if anything, he's going to be cut off, right? He's not going to stop to think. Secondarily, how far out are medics? We need more units here, comma, there's a crowd. For me, there's a crowd feels unnecessary. Like, if you're working in the field with another police officer, they're going to see the crowd, right? They'll know that they're there. Two, I feel like if that's a common understanding that they're working together all of the time, he would understand why that they need more units anyway, especially if this is the same group of people that they have continuing problems with.
That could go back to the frantic thing too, where he could be, if he's freaking out, he could say, I got people crawling up my ass. Like, say something a bit more,
right.
Not there is a crowd forming.
So that is dialogue.
Right.
This is just making sure the reader has everything that they need to know through a shortcut.
Because the crowd could be demonstrated while he's actually treating the patient, because that's usually how scenes are, is you're focusing on this thing, and then when you kind of take a step to breathe, because that's what happens, you look around, you're like, fuck, everybody's eyes are on me. And so like, that would be the time to mention there's a crowd possibly through the scene development as he's treating the patient, or you make it known a little bit more casually or immediate within the dialogue.
There was a couple of lines in here that I really loved. This is maybe pandering a little bit, but I did love that getting coffee was just like anything else done in a blue uniform these days. Those who didn't help felt like they were supposed to hate you, even if they weren't sure why.
That line was great.
Eloquently put this, like, I feel like it's such a depiction of the times where it's like people feel like they're supposed to not like cops, even though they don't have a personal reason to. And so I thought that was just a great sign of the times sort of line that the author put in.
Yeah.
I kind of noted it, and just so everybody knows, like, the formatting of how when you get my notes on here, I put blue for cold, things that I didn't like, pink for hot, things I did like. I had a lot of pink in this story. There was another, when we get into the live tissue stuff, pink bubbled out of the hole with each breath, and the pig's trachea began to pull to one side beneath its fatty cheek. I thought that was, I think a lot of people get nervous about using too many adjectives, or they don't use enough, and that was just the perfect, the word selection and the adjectives used there. And then following up there with half its limbs were gone, its jaw smashed apart, red bandages and dressings obscured, the countless holes. Another further down that page, we get to, leaving that day, head to toe stained brown with dry blood, John closed his hands in prayer and lied that he hoped to never use that training in real life. A perfect indication of ego and where his head is at. Like, I just absolutely loved that. Before that last sign of the section break, we criticized one of the section breaks. This is the perfect section break. And after all, his pig had lasted longer than the rest.
Yeah, I thought that was the perfect way to end that.
Fucking amazing.
Yes.
Like, just absolutely incredible. One more, I won't keep going on here, but I just have to point out some of my favorite things in this piece. John stuffed his excitement down to where all guilty memories live.
Yes. Oh my God.
Just one of those things where, like, if I'm pulling a quote out of this to put on the back of the book or in it, like, holy shit.
That one, I wish that I had wrote that first.
Yeah. It's one of those lines where you're like, fuck, why didn't I think of that?
One thing I did, I know you said it shouldn't be fucked with too much. The one way I saw the live tissue section could be improved, or just a flaw that I saw within it, was there was no description of sound. Whether it was blood, like that's the sound of the tissue, the pigs making sound, instructors. I mean, other than calling corpsmen, there could be description of panting, like heavy breathing. When you're really like gassed, like you can hear your pulse rate, like things like that.
Those, I think, the checklist that I always run through when writing those types of scenes are just, let's run down the 5 senses. Which ones apply here? Which are gonna, you know, what am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am
Yeah.
I feeling? Like if we're running down those, you don't necessarily need to use all 5 of them, but if you're hitting 3 out of 5, you're probably creating a pretty good picture.
And I would say of all the things I described, I would pick one.
Yeah.
You know, I'd pick the pig or I could hear, you know, the shit in my ears. Like, I think Schumann is absolutely right. Like, don't fuck with it too much, because you'll ruin it. But that was just something that I noticed. The one line that I'm looking at right now that I really, really liked toward the end was Tony was a veteran cop, but immediately followed the rookie's instruction. Because if you've ever been in a traumatic situation where there's someone who has more years on, but less experience in certain scenarios, that's it. In one fucking in half a sentence, because there's a comma there, in half a sentence, he describes an entire dynamic of a relationship. You know, of someone arriving on scene where that person is senior to them, but they know, yep, okay.
Going back to those details and the visceral sensory experience, I wanted to linger with certain moments a little bit longer. Like when John puts the patient into the back of the ambulance and they take off, we are immediately taken out of that scene.
Yes.
And if we're talking about a trauma scene where there's a lot of blood, there's smoke, there's all these cars, there's people around, like I wanted to linger with that for just a little bit longer. And you know, talking about the different senses, I think a lot of writers rely too heavily on the visual. And it would be really, really interesting to see where the writer could take that moment, just hitting all the other different senses like we were just talking about. I think that would really benefit that moment.
It's almost like in a movie where a guy busts off 500 rounds without changing a magazine. Like it's, you know if you've been there that like there's a lot of shit left all over the place. There's still people screaming at you. Like nothing changes. It's just a vehicle leaving.
And I think to that point too, along with that, I think again breaking up the paragraphs there is going to let us linger in that moment a little bit longer.
Yeah.
I think breaking up the paragraph, we move through the moment very quickly with the big paragraphs.
We could even, going back to Tyler's point earlier about the crowd, like similar to the pig and the burpees, like we could go from scene to crowd. Like the cut back part can be the crowd. Like what is the crowd doing? How do the people feel? Also, going back to like the sensory thing from that last scene, when he had the bleed stopped, he knelt back. This has been driving me insane because you can't actually kneel backwards. You can only kneel forwards.
So kind of like if you're sitting like on your heels in some sense and you're bent over, you are kind of, I guess, leaning back in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So no
or if you're on
reader's
both
gonna
knees and you come to a knee backward, like
That'd
you're
be
moving
your
that leg
haunches.
backward.
Yeah.
More.
Okay, but do any of you want your reader stopping your story to do this?
That's a great point.
Right.
To kneel down and see if you can actually kneel back.
Right. And so this is actually a great transition point to a couple of other things. We have 2 different kinds of gauze in here. We have compression gauze, we have combat gauze. Combat gauze is not only capitalized as a proper noun, it's also italicized. Also, I do not know the difference between combat gauze and compression gauze. I also don't know.
That was where I thought of the
I
audience.
was like,
as well.
I was racking my brains as I read that on. It was the same thing with the axillary thing because like, I'm pretty sure that's the brachiocephalic artery, not the but same thing with combat gauze. I was like, is that a brand name? Because I was like, is that a brand name? And I couldn't remember if it was.
Name.
Is it a brand name?
Yeah, because hemostatic gauze, and he mentions hemostatic.
That's
Okay,
it, not
and
compression. Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was where, but I didn't know. I was sitting there
And then
questioning myself.
again, like who's
on
your
that.
audience too?
Yeah.
And so it seems to be like for a story like this, when it is very specific and kind of niche, like when you're going into military or first responder, that's going to be mostly your audience. But in order to broaden your audience, you almost have to be as vague as possible. And and when you start using the hemostatic agents or combat gauze or whatever, just pick one and you kind of just stick to it. And that's just your one descriptive word.
I think brand is important if it adds to the story. If it, in this case, the brand of the gauze does not add to the story.
And even hemostatic agent, again, you're kind of pulling the reader out of that moment, like hemostatic, like you're educating in some sense. But if you just say gauze, everybody just knows, and they can kind of just fill in the blank there. They don't. It's not. It doesn't contribute.
So you're leaving room for the reader to imagine on their own level.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. We do this quite nicely with the gloves. When the author talks about putting the gloves on, and that was one of my favorite parts. There's little reservoirs at the fingertips, and with the speeding, that this was the fastest he's ever gone on a street with mailboxes. Right. Like
that was a great line.
we can we can do that with the gauze. We can do that with, or we can pivot and like specificity is generosity. Your reader doesn't know until they know. So sometimes the more specific you can be, the better. You're giving them everything that they need. But to the earlier point, if the gauze is the thing, then just focus on the gauze. If the sound is the thing, then just focus on the sound. And that's what your reader will pick up on.
At the same time, you do have to feel like that they're speaking from some kind of authority and some kind of competency and everything. So you do want to throw in maybe brachial artery, because it just shows that, okay, he knows what he's talking about. Or maybe you use the brand name of gauze, and that's just it, because you see that that he's a subject matter expert within this thing, and that just kind of gives credibility to the author, that not only is he speaking from a literary sense, he's also speaking from an experience sense, or at least a researched stand.
And like I said, if the brand name adds to the story or helps in character development, like if we were talking about pistols and the fact that our protagonist used a Glock, maybe for many readers that is that shows them where it's a character development twist. Like they chose that specific brand in the gun community that says certain things about a person. So in that case, it's like it ends. And I think there's other instances like that. Again, I don't think gauze in the selection thereof, the brand name, is like adding to character development or story development.
As probably part of the intended audience who's going to be reading this passage, I am looking for exactly what Keith's saying. Like, I when I see that, I feel like, yes, I'm connecting. He knows what he's talking about. He has ethos.
But you as a reader, I mean, if you're speaking personally, like you as a reader, would you fault someone for not including that?
I think I may think
if they just said gauze instead of describing
and
you know
that Todd talked about that qualification, that ethos, and so but you also said it's kind of this niche first responder military audience who's probably coming across something like this. Well, if that is the case, then we are looking for that credibility. If we're looking for a more general audience, then it's just gauze is fine. But it's who do we think this is going?
I don't necessarily think that it has to be an either or. My point to this particular issue is that they don't line up. It's fine to put we can have 17 kinds of gauze. Okay, I don't care how much gauze this cop uses on this street with this man. What I care is that the second instance of gauze was not formatted or received in the same manner. So as a reader, I had to stop and ask, well, where did I go wrong the first time with the gauze?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like the hemostatic agents in the gauze, like what are they doing, and how's that coagulating the blood? And like you can kind of talk about how then it's shown. I
do love when authors kind of go down that niche description where they get like, it's like almost like if you're thinking again in like film terms where they zoom in on like the molecules happening. It's like almost as cool, and then you zoom back out, or when you're slowing down the bullet rotating through the air.
And I think the author has the talent to do that.
Yeah,
100%.
For sure.
And I love it when they do that. I love to get in, and that's another way to slow down the scene in a way that you can soak it up more. And that's 100%. I didn't think of that before. I think that's 100% something that could have been done there with the gauze and the treating of getting almost microscopic and going in and out of that. That could have been really cool.
Which would also serve your earlier point about sensory imaging.
Yep.
We don't know what this kid looks like. We know that he's wearing jeans because the denim is soaked by blood. But like, maybe we do something else with like honing in on that, you know?
Yeah, and who is this person? Are they tight Wranglers on a cowboy kid, or is it, Jinko jeans on a skater kid? Like, I don't know that, I don't think you need to say what brand of jeans they're wearing, but if you are giving some other indication of who is being treated, then you can kind of color in the rest of that yourself.
And it's revealed later in the story that he was possibly a member of the National Guard. So it's like, does he have that haircut, or is he in between drill weekends and he's got a little bit of scruff going on? Like, does he look vaguely military to John as he's working on him?
Yeah, with John having military experience himself, if this guy was in the National Guard, he might notice in the back of it might be a thought that occurs to him, like, this guy looks like he's in the military.
This looks like one of my soldiers. Like, like they just said.
Right, he's got the haircut, he's got the, or whatever, or tattoos, like there's probably some sort of indication. It would have occurred to John, probably, that this person looks like they could be in the military.
That was one of the other things I was wondering about John, is going through reading it a couple of times. I couldn't, so I get this idea from the first page, for instance, 3/4 of the way down, he's kind of jaded already after being on the job. And he seems like really naive. He's like, it's a lot more overdoses. and domestic disputes, a lot less Lamborghinis and shootouts. I'm like, then I find out this guy has been in the military, and it seems like he's received pretty advanced training. Did he really come into the Philadelphia Police Department thinking he was going to be running around with Will Smith, shooting?
So I think kind of, because when you do have like this military service, you have this preconceived expectations of what first responders are going to do, and then it usually disappoints.
I actually think that worked really well. He's being a little bit sarcastic with the Martin Lawrence.
Yeah.
I don't think he's saying he literally thought he was going to be rolling around in a Lamborghini, but it's like kind of that sarcastic, like, man, what they sold me and what I'm getting are two fucking different things.
Also, Lamborghini, just as this is finicky, but Lamborghini was not capitalized as a proper noun. So but we have to pay attention to these things.
I tried to like go over I think both this and the other piece we were like, clearly a copy editor could go through. I tried not to focus too much on the copy edit stuff.
I did.
Good.
I really liked dangerous confidence. It filled him with dangerous confidence from the live tissue, because like I guarantee everyone, no matter what your experience, everyone at this table can think of an example of their own of dangerous confidence.
McMap, any sort of hand-to-hand training that you get where all of a sudden, I'm
everybody. Then everybody's getting passed out in the barracks, and like it's just
or going downtown thinking that you can take all comers, and whoops.
Yeah.
It
turns out the guy that goes to the jiu-jitsu gym is a little bit more qualified to kick my ass.
Yeah, that's a great point, Keith. That it does immediately appeal. When we're worried about the idea of homeostatic gauze or combat gauze kind of isolating some of the readers, this is a very inclusive phrase that brings readers in. And I thought about how when I would visit my dad once a year during the summers, go horseback riding, then I think I can actually ride a horse, because I did for like a week out of every summer, and then like I was just dangerous enough to myself to get myself fucked up, and so I think that's a really inclusive,
Yeah, I'm glad you guys noticed it too, because that was what I was worried about, was that it's such a good 2-word combination, and that it would get lost.
I guess it's like I didn't see maybe because like you were talking about earlier about making John look more like the author, because I know the author. I didn't catch on to like his visual appearance as much, because the way that he described like his thoughts, I kind of just pictured him even more like me too. So I like put myself in that situation. Like again, I relate to the story, but I'm glad you called out like this physical description of the character, because he did such a good job describing his thoughts and that dangerous confidence. And then but also like
in the beginning, we have quiet firmness, and that really scaffolds the character at the beginning and the end.
And that's where I think a lot of like, again, the story is a lot about these contradictions of like we're talking about favorite sentences in a sense. He's like, John spent the hours after shift fighting a disgusting smile, and when he returned to work the next day, his head was barely fit through the door.
Yeah,
and it's like, in anybody who's done something that they're proud of, you usually feel shameful that you're proud of, and it's just like, why is that? And so that conflict was great, and then he did something pretty remarkable of treating this kid when nobody else was able to, but then at the end he just solidified it in his in the haste of being a hero. He had just prevented blood from flowing onto the pavement, nothing more. And it's like, that really is the reality of it when somebody dies, and so anybody who can relate to that can see it. Anybody who can't, damn, I guess that really is like, it was just a very simple way to explain letting somebody die in your hands in some sense, or to your own doing in some sense.
Well, and to the credit of the author, the recommendations we're making here as far as beefing up the physical descriptions or some of the sensory descriptions, that is infinitely easier to do. That's an easy fix to make. Yeah. The way we get inside the head of the protagonist here, that is a difficult thing to write. What the author pulled off in this, as far as like getting inside the mind of this person, is just fantastic. It's really very difficult to do that on the page, and so it's like if one of the things to walk away from here is beef up the physical description. Like, that's easy. That's a half sentence here, a sentence there. Like, that's no big deal. The big heavy lift is here, in my opinion.
So that's actually a great place to pivot. But before we give it back to Mac, I want to come back to what you guys just also kind of touched on, is the conflict in the character development. I want everyone to share in one, it doesn't have to be a sentence, quip it. What do you think the conflict in this story is?
I think it's and it's what makes me feel like I know this character, because it is so in tune with so many people that we know, probably including ourselves, which is this braggadocious confidence on one hand and self-loathing or self-deprecating and humbleness too, all wrapped up into one person in many instances. And if we were to nail it down in one sentence, I think that the last sentence of this is absolutely perfect and completely encapsulates the conflict within this character, and that is, he put his truck in drive and pulled out of the precinct, grateful he only had to bear the shame of a dead man without the added weight of a medal.
Yeah.
I thought that was
Yeah.
such a great, like, I say it now and it gives me a little
I'm
bit
about
of
to say, I
chills.
just got chills. Like,
Yeah.
it really does. And the paragraph before that is, he had done just enough to absolve himself of shame for inaction. It's like,
I didn't actually like that line.
so I loved it because it just like, he did as much as he could. Like, and to kind of talk about this just a little bit more is, like, he did say like he did enough of himself for inaction, and he had this conflict of, oh, he wished he did more, but in reality, the way it's even described almost objectively is, he only had enough time to do that before he could hand off to the paramedics. And so at that point, he really had no more responsibility to that patient, because he did everything he could. But no matter doing whatever you want to do, when you look back at it, you always think about what you could have done more, especially when you have this personality.
And I do not
this
disagree
job.
with you. And I think it's a beautiful sentence, and it's great to read out loud. But is it accurate to the story? Because he does
I think
feel
so.
shameful.
I think so, because I think so.
I don't think that's why he's quitting, though. I think he's
So
quitting
that
because
that brings another question, though, is the notes I made on this
Okay,
is,
so this is it.
Okay.
What's the conflict?
This is the conflict. For
Right.
me, the conflict is, like Marty said, people we know or ourselves. He left the military because it wasn't good enough, and the grass is always greener, right? So got out, civilian life kind of sucked too. So instead of going back to the military, he's like, no, that's not good enough, but maybe the police service will do it for me. And then the police service doesn't compare to military service, and then neither of them are good. Or maybe there's this like idolization of the person that he was while he was in the military, and there's a lot. There's a lot of conflict there. There's several.
Yes.
But that is the conflict of the story, is never being satisfied with life after something like that. And I think it captures it very, very well.
I think it's not the essential conflict of the story, but a conflict that is very evident. It's the first one that we're exposed to is. This is someone who's about to break up with somebody, and anybody who's broken up with someone knows that it's like, it takes some moral courage to kind of let somebody down, and it's not you, it's me, and it's like he's thinking like, I'm about to have this breakup. He's very uncomfortable that he's about to have to break up with and it's like, wait, we like you. It's like we can work this out, and it's like, so it's he's about to dump somebody, and
I knew you were a nice guy.
No, so that's the thing. I don't have the moral courage, and I just linger, and we would
The
just
old
both
"it's
be
not you, it's me" line.
Just ghost
I'm
him.
13 years into the Marine Corps.
the other thing, like, I guess, to understand you correctly, are we saying what our conflict with the story is, or the conflict of the story?
You can answer.
Okay.
You can take the floor as you
'Cause
see fit, Tyler Carroll.
The way, like, my biggest conflict with the story as a whole is, it seems as if like this one call is the reason John is leaving the force, and I imagine it's more, and he doesn't really allude to any other reasons. And
We have a life-saving medal for a life he did not save.
Yeah.
To me, that feels like one of the central conflicts of the story, is that in both organizations, what is being applauded and accoladed is spiritually and ethically inaccurate.
Yeah.
And both sides of the fence warrants that response. And this is, I think, part of the reason why I struggled with that line. The sentence is beautiful. It is true to the story. It is not true to the character, because he did feel shame for inaction despite having acted. And that's the same as the medal. He's given a medal for saving a life, or is nominated a medal for saving a life. He did not save that life, according to the sentences in this story.
Yeah.
To me, that feels like the central conflict of this story.
It's not even just that he didn't save a life, but he didn't save a life because he failed to do some very, very basic things that he was trained to do. You know, it's not like he did his best.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And he was the best trained one there.
Right. He's got the aid kit that he's talking about. Everybody's making fun of him for. It's his moment to use it, and he still like skips all the other very basic steps in order to stabilize the patient.
And to kind of talk about that, the actual actions of leading to the patient's death, in some sense, he's like, I told Rivera to do them. Yeah. When you go back to the story, he really didn't. The only thing he told Rivera was open his eyes and keep him awake. Yeah. That's the only dialogue he actually said to him. And then next he says Rivera grabbed his head and tried.
Yeah, which like even
it's
I
like maybe
if
he like shook his head or something, like, hey, all right, slapped him on the cheek or something, like that would show like, okay, now it's a jolting action on the neck.
Yeah.
You know, but when you just say like, hey, you grab his head, it's like, okay, well,
yeah,
in reality, I'm gonna grab the patient's head to control C-spine. And like talking to him is what keeps him awake, and then maybe like a slapping on the head. But like if he actually shook his head or something like that, then he could be like, maybe I wasn't as specific to Rivera what he should have done or something.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do remember when I read that, I remember thinking like, oh, I must have missed that part in there, and I didn't actually go back and like a little bit of laziness on my side. Maybe I should, because I remember having that like glitch in my head of like, oh, did he move his neck? And then I never went back and actually checked. So yeah, that is interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. So unless anyone has any pressing points they want to add, or
I just like kind of like a final thought on it. I thought it was a really well done story, and that there's a little bit of fat to be trimmed, a few things to be cleaned up, but overall, this is something that I think the author should be really proud of as far as the story goes.
Yes.
100%.
So I will say that right now you guys are saying you're very critical, but my takeaway is this was extremely validating, because this is not the kind of writing I do or have experience doing. So this was like a huge gamble to see where it would land. And overall, you guys just basically praised it and then would pick apart little details that were all super helpful. It was never, this doesn't work, or the character sucks, the story's boring. It was just little details of how to sharpen things up. So I don't want to go through all the notes and justify every word choice, and because that doesn't really matter.
But some of them might.
Okay, so some of them. Let's go back to the gauze.
Yes, please.
I'm glad you pointed out that I used two different, because that doesn't work at all. And some people were saying I should be specific, and some people said I should just write gauze. If I was to go edit this and improve it, I would keep hemostatic, because I wrote it for this knowing the audience. So I knew that, like you said, that was my point, was that you guys would read hemostatic, and it kind of like validates that character. Like, okay, he knows what he's doing. Where if you guys read just gauze, like, okay, that's not enough. And then I used combat gauze because it's the brand name. I think I would take that out. But after reading a bunch of Jack Carr books, where that's like his whole thing is he just constant, and it adds to his characters. It doesn't here. But that's what was on my mind. I was like, oh yeah, I'll add that in there, which it really didn't benefit the character or the story at all. Pacing, more paragraphs, appreciated all that. I was really excited that you guys pictured John Goodman, because that's who I was picturing when I wrote it without saying it.
Because he slaps door frames.
Yeah. Also, it didn't flow naturally with the conversation at the time, but when we meet that character and he says, anyways, that kid died, I literally laughed out loud. It's like, anyways.
It was a great character, not a major character in the story, but it was a great character.
Yeah.
It really was. It was a great character.
Really happy to hear that one landed. I didn't realize how much like lack of detail there was about John, which I would go back and change. This is fiction, but it's loosely based on a real experience. So in my head, it was me as John, and so I didn't feel the need to add the details. I just kind of assumed.
Of course not. You're quite busy knowing that it's you.
Yeah, I'm like, oh yeah, this is me. This is what I did. I didn't have to add, oh, his hairline is fucking gone. And, details that the reader would probably appreciate. So thank you for highlighting that.
I guess I wasn't too far off in picturing it. I didn't know if this was writers, take inspiration from all sorts of either your own experiences or an experience your buddy had or anything like that. So I didn't know exactly where it was coming from. I didn't know if you intended for us to view you in that spot or not. And I think that's where it would have been, it could have been helpful. If you would have described it as like, fucking Captain Ahab in a flannel, then I would be like, okay, Mac's talking about himself.
I also think this is a short story, and it would set quite a precedent for the rest of a book, but it could absolutely be a chapter.
Or even like a collection of connected short stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Tyler's probably not shocked, but the collection of stories I'm working on, I pulled this out of, tried to fictionalize it for the workshop. So it is in the middle of a bunch of other stories. The the radio dialogue that you guys were ripping into, saying like they're crawling up my ass. Just I think only like another cop or a firefighter would recognize, like when you talk on the radio to very, even like more so than the military, you're like kind of confined to a very specific lingo and way of talking.
Again, specificity is generosity.
Yeah.
I would be much more prone to believe that than this.
Yeah. So saying like there's a crowd developing is literally what was on the radio. So I would want to keep that, but I can see why, even though that is the truth, fictionalizing the dialogue would help the story.
You might even be able to jump in and say, like, as an aside, like,
Half sentence.
Yeah.
Like what he wanted to say was they're crawling on my ass or something like, you know.
Perfect.
Or have him think that's a thought.
Right.
I would believe that as a thought.
Yeah.
Even putting in there like, like the protagonist observing that, man, radio talk is dry. Or, like just kind of like the way you just said, like even for somebody from the military, police talk is dry over the radio.
Yeah.
Like that would
Get that across right away.
Yeah.
Did you have any questions?
I see why the author isn't allowed to be mic'd up for this, because I kept wanting to jump in and be like, wait, no, I did this, or ask a question then. So it's hard to go back and remember all the questions that popped through my mind because there were about 1 million of them. But no, overall, just thank you guys for taking the time to read it critically, and it's clear everyone put effort into it. Didn't just read it and say good job. So thanks. Thank you for bringing it to us.
Yeah.